Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a really fascinating paradox today, the massive disconnect between dropping bombs accurately and actually winning a war. It's a puzzle that has plagued military planners for decades. How on earth can a technologically superior force, one that can hit any target on the planet with near-perfect precision, constantly find itself stuck in unwinnable, protracted conflicts? It's a multi-trillion-dollar question, and it directly impacts global security, your tax dollars, and even the prices you pay at the gas pump. To really unpack this, we need to start with a startling number, 16. Back in 2002, the U.S. military ran a $250 million war game called Millennium Challenge. This was a massive simulation, specifically designed to test high-tech, rapid-strike doctrines against a Middle Eastern adversary. Planners naturally expected a swift, decisive victory. But instead, they watched in absolute horror as 16 of their cutting-edge warships, including a full aircraft carrier, were sunk to the bottom of the ocean on the very first day of the exercise. If this had been real life, we're talking about the largest naval defeat since Pearl Harbor, with over 20,000 casualties. But as declassified summaries of the event outline, the military institution didn't actually learn from this catastrophic failure. Instead, like a gamer hitting the reset button when they're losing, they did something unthinkable. They just paused the simulation, magically refloated all their sunken ships, and altered the rules to guarantee a win. So to understand how this kind of historical hubris traps us in endless conflicts today, we're going to break this massive geopolitical puzzle down into a logical 6-step journey. The warning ignored, tactics versus strategy, the Jenga fallacy, the escalation trap, historical echoes, and finding a way out. Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, the warning ignored. What happened during that 2002 war game is incredible. You had the opposing commander, retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper, completely paralyzing the multi-billion-dollar Blue Force. The Blue Force was relying on network-centric warfare, basically assuming they'd have total electronic dominance. But Van Riper, commanding the low-tech Red Force, simply refused to play along. He initiated absolute electronic silence. Instead of trackable radios, he used motorcycle couriers, light signals, and coded messages broadcast from civilian call-to-prayer speakers. He literally used pre-industrial means to render America's cutting-edge satellite surveillance entirely useless. And then he launched a massive, preemptive swarm attack using small boats that completely overwhelmed the fleet. But rather than adapt to this brilliant reality check, the institution rigged the game. They refloated the ships and imposed all these artificial constraints on Van Riper. They actually forced his Red Force to turn on their anti-aircraft radar at specific times just so they could be easily destroyed. They banned him from preemptive strikes, and they arbitrarily constrained his swarming, small boat tactics. Basically, they protected their existing doctrines by forcing the enemy to act exactly how they wanted them to act. It's a fatal cognitive flaw in military planning. Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, Tactics versus Strategy. Professor Robert Pape is an expert in military strategy who has been running Iran war simulations for 20 years, and he coined a brilliant phrase, bombs don't just hit targets, they change politics. It perfectly explains the disconnect. When we drop smart bombs, we usually get near-perfect tactical success. We can hit specific buildings 90% of the time. But wars aren't just about hardware. They're decided by political outcomes. You might physically destroy a facility, but simultaneously you trigger highly unpredictable political reactions from the target's population and their leadership. And that leads right into Section 3, the Jenga fallacy. Let's see why traditional regime change strategies consistently backfire. Planners often assume an adversary operates like a fragile game of Jenga. In this brittle hierarchy myth, they think if you just pull out the right block, like taking out a top leader, the whole tower is going to collapse. But that's a fundamentally flawed image. Regimes, especially the Iranian regime, actually operate as an adaptive matrix. With a population of 92 million and a highly structured revolutionary guard, it's a resilient, almost biological system. When you violently remove a node at the top, the system doesn't just crumble. It adapts. It fills the gap with whoever is left, and it usually hardens with even more radical replacements. This illustrates the supreme danger of the Jenga approach. Professor Pape points out a fascinating unintended consequence. The assassinated leadership often functioned as a guardrail. For instance, they'd issued fatwas, strict religious edicts, against developing nuclear weapons. By taking them out, those vital religious guardrails literally died with them. So now, the new, much more aggressive leadership has absolutely every incentive to pursue a nuclear arsenal for their own survival, figuring they have nothing left to lose. Now, Let's break down Section 4, the escalation trap, and look at exactly how this spirals out of control. Professor Pape maps this out into a predictive, three-stage roadmap of conflict. It shows us step by step how the pursuit of one unresolved military objective ends up dragging a nation deeper and deeper into an unwinnable situation. So stage 1 is the smart bomb trap. You hit the nuclear enrichment facilities with bunker busters. Near perfect tactical success. But here's the strategic failure. You didn't actually secure the nuclear material. Because before those bombs even fell, an adaptive adversary already dispersed and hid their enriched uranium. So sure, you made the rubble bounce, but the enemy still possesses enough 60% enriched uranium to fashion up to 16 nuclear bombs, and you have no idea where it is. That failure naturally pushes planners into stage 2, regime change. The logic goes, if we can't bomb the uranium, let's overthrow the leadership to find it. But as we just learned, this just creates a harder-line regime. In retaliation, this new regime initiates horizontal escalation. They don't fight the superior military toe-to-toe. Instead, they attack neighbors, launch drones, and threaten global energy markets in the confined waters of the Strait of Hormuz. A disruption there skyrockets global inflation and the cost of the gas in your car. And ironically enough, this is the exact same geographic vulnerability that General Van Riper exploited to sink the Blue Force back in 2002. Finally, because the global economy is hurting and that nuclear material is still missing, planners get backed into stage 3, the ground option. Desperation to locate the missing material forces a massive ground invasion, and Professor Pape warns that history consistently shows ground invasions into sovereign, populated nations directly incentivize global suicide terrorism. It threatens the homeland, it protracts the conflict indefinitely, and crucially, it drains U.S. resources away from the broader, long-term geopolitical competition with China. This brings us to Section 5, historical echoes. Because the escalation trap isn't some new theory, it's a recurring cycle. We see these exact same patterns echoing through history. Look at Vietnam in the 1960s. Decades of intense tactical bombing entirely failed to stop the political will and logistical pipeline of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1996, assassinating the Chechen leader didn't end the conflict at all. It sparked Operation Jihad, which was a brutal wave of suicide attacks led by a harder-line successor. We saw these exact same unintended consequences after regime change strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan. And just like in the 2002 Millennium Challenge, clear institutional warnings about our vulnerabilities to asymmetric tactics are routinely and willfully ignored to protect the status quo. Adversaries don't beat us by matching our military hardware. They beat us by playing the political long game. Which leaves us with our final section, finding a way out. How do we navigate the complex geopolitics of the Middle East moving forward? According to Pape's analysis, policymakers are basically left with 3 stark choices. First, double down on military pressure, move further up the escalation ladder, and risk a global supply chain collapse and yet another forever war. Second, accept a modest, limited political defeat by halting the air campaign right now and cutting their losses. Or third, acknowledge a really difficult geopolitical truth. Sometimes freezing a problem through robust deterrence and diplomacy for 20 years is actually vastly superior to aggressively chasing 100% absolute security, because chasing that 100% security is usually exactly what springs the trap. Ultimately, when we look at the undeniable disconnect between hitting targets from the air and achieving lasting peace on the ground, we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves a really tough question. Does military escalation actually make us any safer, or does it simply spring a trap of our own making? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus and always look beyond the immediate tactical victories.